Our text this evening is Hebrews 11 verse 27. By faith, that is, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Last week we saw that Moses, at the age of 40, when he was in the prime of his life, rejected everything with which he had grown up in Egypt, all the riches which Egypt offered, and associated himself rather with the afflicted people of God. Moses had a proper perspective of who Egypt and who Israel were. He understood by faith that Egypt was the seed of the serpent, who was seeking to crush the seed of the woman in the afflicted people of God, Israel. That is to say, he saw Christ in Israel. And because he saw Christ in Israel, he sought to become associated with Israel, and thus to have the blessings of belonging to Israel. He put greater value on that, the reproach of Christ, which was in the people of Israel, that all of the treasures and pleasures which were offered to him as an Egyptian prince. But Moses' association with God's people did not go as he had planned. Exodus chapter 2 describes it. Moses imagined that he would become the leader and deliverer of God's people. That as he left the palace of Pharaoh and associated himself with Israel, they would immediately see him as their leader. They would gladly welcome him as their deliverer. He would start a rebellion, overthrow Pharaoh, and lead God's people out of Egypt. And he shows that this is his intention by killing an Egyptian immediately after he leaves Pharaoh's court. But this did not lead to the people following him as their natural leader, but rather it led to Moses fleeing from Egypt into the land of Midian, where he stayed for 40 years. Because the faith of Moses was strong, we saw that last week, it was remarkable, but yet it was impure and needed to be purified from much carnality. Moses needed to learn that salvation for God's people is not to be found in the arm of flesh. It will come in God's way, in God's time. And so God sent Moses to the land of Midian, the backside of the desert. And there he spent 40 years working as a lonely shepherd, learning and being trained to be the leader of the people of God in God's own time. And only after having learned all of that in Midian was he ready, by faith, to forsake Egypt for good. Notice Moses forsaking Egypt by faith. Moses forsaking Egypt by faith. First of all, the event, then the difficulty, and finally, the faith. The question which confronts us immediately in our text is, which event is in view here? Because there are two exoduses of Moses from Egypt, as it were. Moses leaves Egypt twice. He left Egypt to go to Midian, and later he leaves Egypt as the leader of God's people, leading the whole lot of them out of Egypt toward the promised land. The first forsaking of Egypt came when he had come to years. He forsook Egypt, he forsook the pleasures and treasures that Egypt had to offer. He killed an Egyptian and he fled from the king. Is that the forsaking of Egypt in our text? Many would say yes, that is what is meant in our text. And they will say this because of what they call the chronology of Hebrews 11. They will argue, well, Hebrews 11 is in chronological order. And what do we see in verse 28? The Passover. And the forsaking of Egypt then had to happen before the Passover. Well, clearly, Moses leaving Egypt happened after the Passover. But Moses fleeing to Midian, and in that sense forsaking Egypt, happened before the Passover. And so we will say, Moses' flight to Midian is in view here. But Hebrews 11 is not strictly chronological. We've already seen that in our series. For example, verse 13. These all died in faith. This speaks of Abraham dying in faith, and later in the same chapter we have the account of Abraham offering Isaac in faith. We don't have a strictly chronological treatment of the lives of the patriarchs there. Really, these all died in faith is a summary statement of the whole life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Hebrews 11 verse 27, our text, is a summary statement covering the entire period of time from Moses leaving Midian, his 40 years in Midian, his coming back to Egypt to be the deliverer of God's people, and his leading them finally out of Egypt, all the way to the Red Sea when the Egyptians were finally destroyed. And throughout all of that period, seen now as one event or episode, Moses forsook Egypt and did not fear the wrath of the king. And so the second event is in view here. Moses' final, decisive forsaking of Egypt as he leaves that house of bondage with Israel following after him. Moses, the deliverer of God's people. This fits, first of all, with the text, because the text says that Moses forsook Egypt. And the idea of forsaking is a complete, decisive, and permanent renunciation and abandonment of Egypt. Moses left Egypt to go to Midian, but the fact is he returned to Egypt. He forsook Egypt permanently and decisively when he led the children of Israel out of the house of bondage. He never returned after that point. Second, this fits better with the truth that Moses did not fear the wrath of the king. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to get around Exodus 2 verse 14. Exodus 2 verse 14. And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. In Exodus 2, Moses clearly fears the wrath of the king, and that is why he runs away to Midian. We call that his flight to Midian. But when he comes back, we see him fearlessly confronting the king of Egypt again and again with the command of God, Let my people go. It fits also with that word endured. He endured as seeing him that is invisible. This final forsaking of Egypt happened after a long period of endurance and the overcoming of many difficulties. First, Moses spent 40 years as a shepherd in Midian. Then he had to endure many difficult audiences with the king of Egypt, during which time Pharaoh's heart was increasingly hardened. And only after all of that, after a long period of endurance, does he finally forsake Egypt for good. This event of Moses forsaking Egypt with all of the children of Israel following him happened some 400 years after they entered Egypt in the first place, after they had been afflicted as the slaves in Egypt for all those centuries, and it occurs in fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. Moses forsakes Egypt now in obedience to God's command. Moses must leave Egypt for good with all of the people of God, because God has prepared for his people a better place, a land called Canaan, which is a picture of heaven, a place where God can have sweet fellowship in the covenant with his beloved people. Egypt was the house of bondage. And from every human perspective, there was no possibility of the people of Israel ever leaving it. Canaan was far, far away. The children of Israel were a multitude of shepherds, and Egypt did not want to let them go, because it suited them to have them as slaves. And besides, the devil, who was behind Egypt, was intent on crushing Israel, because they represented the covenant of God in the midst of the world. And he wanted to annul God's covenant promise and prevent the coming of Jesus Christ. And Moses had to leave or forsake Egypt because Egypt was a corrupting influence on the people of God. And for their spiritual good, they needed to be delivered from this ungodly people, so that they could serve God as a holy people unto the Lord. Egypt in the Bible is a type of the bondage of sin and death. And just as Israel were forced to serve Egypt, so by nature we serve and are enslaved to sin and death. Egypt was a wicked land, a land of terrible, sinful corruption, a land of the wicked oppression of God's people, and a land of gross idolatry. And all of that had to be forsaken. And God had to deliver his own people from Egypt. And even after he delivered them from Egypt, it becomes very clear but Egypt still remains in many of their hearts. They still long for what they had in Egypt. Many of them are longing for the food that they enjoyed in Egypt, are not happy with God's provision for them in the wilderness, and so on. And to achieve this forsaking of Egypt, God sent the 10 plagues, of which we read some. He sent the 10 plagues to prove to the Egyptians that he is the one true and living God, and all of the gods of the Egyptians are worthless vanities. And if you look at the 10 plagues, you will discover that they are all of them attacks on the gods of Egypt. It's God's purpose to get him honor over their gods. For example, the Egyptians worshipped the Nile River. For them it was the source of their life and their prosperity.